Hello, everyone. So I'm very happy to introduce to you. Today, I have in front of me Ian Mackenzie. He's a filmmaker and writer who lives on the Salish Sea with his partner and young son. For over 14 years, he's been tracking the global emergence of new culture. From the desert of Burning Man to the heart of Occupy Wall Street, he has sought and amplified the voices of visionaries, artists, and activists who have been working towards planetary system change. Ian is best known for his films Sacred Economics, Lost Nation Road, Amplify Her, Dear Guardians, and Occupy Love, directed by Velcro Reaper. More recently, he founded the Mythic masculine podcast, exploring in-depth conversation about emerging masculinities, as well as a gathering of stories and live, how do I say this, Ian? Mythopoetic? Is that
you
correct?
got it. Yeah, you got it.
Mythopoetic series illuminating the biggest themes of our time. So welcome. Thank you for accepting my invitation to the podcast today. And I know that you do lots of stuff, and I've been following your work for some time, and I know that your first label that you use is filmmaker. But one of the things that I see is that you go into a very big depth of, as you say, the emergence of culture to be able to get the insight of what you actually put in your films. And that's lovely. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on board today, so that you share how you see the old cultures, the need for new ones, and the, as you call it, the emergence of new cultures. And as you know, this is the trauma division of the podcast. And I have a personal intention of bringing awareness that trauma is not just an accident that happened or losing a parent or something that's like individual and close stuff and like just, my personal story or something that's in a secret in my past. But actually, trauma can also happen from the way that we live, the way that I live, the way that we live as a culture. So I think I have the perfect person in front of me who has that eye and that curiosity. So I'm happy to have you with us today. Do you want to expand on sort of like your story, your biography, and tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me here, Patricia. When I think back as well, what have I really been tracking these last 15 years or so? I should say a little bit more as well. Like I grew up in the suburbs outside Vancouver, Canada, and in many ways, it's sort of nice, but cultural wasteland. If you think about it in another way, where I sort of was in a typical story, I guess, for sort of a middle class suburban kid, and I don't know. There's something that really. Maybe like many, I'll just speak with young men, they awaken to some kind of longing, I think, to be part of something bigger, part of some sense of purpose and meaning. And for me, that really manifested around university, as it often also does, for others, that there's a sense of being exposed to new ideas and new perspectives. And I initially encountered Zen Buddhism around that time that, again, really blasted me open to other ways of perceiving and, things like meditation and the rest. And I really became sort of suspecting of this sense that, the world isn't, or the world could be different than it is. At least it was as it was presented, including the story about, okay, you get a job, start a family, live out your life. And I really remember this moment too. I was like, had this sort of an existential threshold where I felt, this, I don't know what to call it, spirit, life, ancestors were just, they said to me, like, don't fall for it. Like, this isn't it. There is more, there's more. And it was almost like I had to recognize that, to be able to kind of like step through the looking glass in a way, right, into, and then life just suddenly started opening up in new and interesting ways. And that's when I also got really curious about creativity and art and storytelling, and film really came to me because I had this sense by, seeing the different creative mediums of what was the most effective way of shifting perspective, shifting consciousness in a short period of time. And I think I recognize and still do that it's film, the combination of sound and story and narrative and animation, all these things can combine to create a sort of transmission revelation. And of course, distributing it across the internet, at a push of a button, makes it really intriguing, right, as a creative medium. So that's really how I think I headed towards film. But then of course I've expanded, in lots of other mediums, podcast, essaying, things like that. But I still feel I'm tracking the same thing, which is really the question of like, what happened? Like, how did we get here?
That's really good guidance, that right there, when you notice that that's not the way to go. Don't fall for it. That's what you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of is it one of the main things that you do as well as alongside filmmaking, and you work with men, right? Or yeah, how did you come into this calling?
Well, I think as I've approached these different areas of inquiry, my first film was about really looking at like jobs and passion and purpose. A very close friend of mine ended up sort of graduating college, didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, and so he created an internet project where he would work one job a week for a year. It was this idea of trying everything and seeing what he liked. And I came on the road with him, and we I just covered the adventure as best I could, and it was wild and wacky, and learned a lot. And then I turned that into a film, which aired here on the CBC in Canada. And then again, that was my entry into film, where I was like, wow, interesting. And then I started to get drawn more into activism, and really, again, like what is happening. The Iraq War started around 2003. That was a sort of galvanizing moment where I think, like a lot of people who were really not persuaded by the case that was being made by the Americans to go over to Iraq and invade, and so that was sort of a kind of willingness for me to kind of step across from being an observer and more into direct activist. Like I participated in some of the the marching and things like that. So in some ways it awakened a consciousness of participation. And again, from there, continued the thread. I worked on a film, Occupy Love, as was named in the bio, with the director Velcro Ripper, which also was looking at the zeitgeist of the moment and really saw the Occupy movement as this flowering of, again, this activist spirit, like this spirit of another fellow, Charles Eisenstein, who said, the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And then from there, I was drawn into the sense of the rise of the feminine. I was like, well, I feel like there's something happening here. I mean, obviously, it's sort of a cultural mimetic uprising as well. And I tried to understand it by actually looking at the lives of actual women, in this case, DJs and producers, and looking at, well, how are they bringing their creativity and their spirit through? And how could we actually bring in like a mythic dimension? And that's why it became a series and a graphic novel. And then, of course, by studying the feminine, it revealed to me, oh, like, wow, I actually know so little about the masculine. And this occurred around 2015 or so. Other event that happened was my grandfather died. And in going through his stuff, helping, kind of organize his things and, everything after he died, he was quite a, academic and a bookworm, and he had just books and books everywhere in his place. And one particular book was on this stack in the, in the room that really felt, I can't remember, but maybe there was a shaft of light that was, right there on the book and illuminating it perfectly. And it was the book Iron John, which is it's sort of a main foundational text of the mythopoetic men's movement that really started in the sort of early 90s, and it has since continued, but had a period of going underground and is now flourishing again, to this day. Mr. Bly, who wrote the book, Robert Bly, also passed not too long ago. And so for me, that was, again, this awakening into understanding masculinity from a mythic perspective and illuminating so much of my own journey in a way that, before that I just assumed it was, my own personal wrestling. But then he reflected back so much of what at least masculinity in the Western culture seems to recognize as familiar patterns. And then again, I also sort of dedicated myself to men's work. I did the Weekend with Mankind project, which is a pretty a well-known organization, and I've since connected with other groups like Sacred Sons and beyond, and really just tried to understand, what is the heart of men's work, and also started a podcast, The Mythic Masculine, where I've tried to both bridge the previous generation of mythopoetic men's work, as well as bring in a lot of voices now that are also adding, so much to the ecosystem of the conversation, which is really vital as we, reimagine what masculinity could be in the times to come.
I really connected to something that you said just right now about this reflecting back, that I have a struggle and I have a problem finding, I don't know, my purpose, having what am I doing here, or just the sensation of fitting in somewhere, right? And I don't mean necessarily in a social setting, but like in life, in the world, right? And I totally relate, and I understand, and I've seen how so many people live these struggles that are associated with trauma in a sense. I think it's just me, right? It's only in my bubble that I feel this experience, that I'm going through this, and I'm like sort of like the weird person who's this is something that I usually refer to that happens when we're in a trauma reaction, that we believe everybody has got it right and I'm the only one who hasn't been able to get your shit together, right? This sense of isolation. And I would love to hear from you what you've seen. I mean, I think we all live it, all of us, right? Like, well, at least, I mean, many of us. Lucky the ones that don't, right? But how is this lived from a male perspective?
How does trauma lived, you mean?
This sensation of isolation, and you're the only one who has this weird struggle. And I'm putting words, this is not what you said, but of course, feel free to talk about this. But it's also the feeling that it's up to me to fix this. Like, it's entirely up to me. Nobody else will come, or even the concept of help, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things to unpack here. I think, one is, what at least a mythic understanding of what trauma is or could be. And I've encountered a number of definitions, and at least a working definition that I tend to go towards is, in a sense, like a happening or like an event that has distorted one's capacity to be authentic in the world, right? And so, from that place, I would say, okay, well, and I understand, from trauma theory, that it's like, it's not the event itself that is traumatic; it's the inability to, to kind of reset the nervous system and to return to that place of authenticity. And so, for men, I mean, how that's often dealt with or coped with. I mean, a lot, not just men, sure, but I mean, certainly men is often numbing out, drugs and alcohol, falling into deep depression, acting out in violence. So many ways in which there's a sense of, do I matter? Because I don't know, again, is it something that is part of the masculine soul to live from a place of purpose, to be in service? I mean, looking to indigenous cosmologies, they seem to be less, or more willing to claim that, yeah, there is something there, in the masculine spirit that wants to be of service deeply. And I spoke with Indigenous elder Pat McCabe in one of my conversations, where she said, the gift of the masculine is to be architects of the dream, right? And I just love that as a mythic image. And again, in the absence of that, sort of absence of a sense of purpose, then that spiritual longing, or that longing, can just be coped with in a number of different ways. The sort of archetype of the lone wolf is strong, right, within masculine culture, in some ways. And other ways, of course, there's this sort of band of brothers also is a strong archetype in the culture. But often men feel there is a sense of like, I can't really be vulnerable or show my feelings or tap into that, some might say this more feminine, vulnerable side. And so there's a need to kind of do it alone, like the lone hero. And I think that's shifted certainly in the last little bit, where, and particularly even in the younger generations, where they don't seem to be as inflicted with the same hangups, and the same baggage around showing emotion, around showing vulnerability. Like, I'm encouraged by that. And at the same time, I still think that, yeah, this archetype of the hero is still quite strong, right? The hero that sort of prevails. I mean, and we see that shifting as well, of course, when you look to the Avengers, right? I mean, a number of heroes all working together again. So there's some encouragement there. But generally, I think that's how it tends to show up, like the self-perpetuating isolation that leads to more and more sense of disconnection and isolation.
One of the things that I see that usually comes up when men's work is addressed is the power of community and bringing community back together. And while I personally believe, but I also think this is what I get from what you just said, there is a drive in men to, hey, I want to feel that I can work through stuff without needing resources outside of myself. So that's sort of like something that we might need to respect at some point, right? But also sort of like we could say the shadow side of that is that I believe that there's actually no one else and I have to carry an extra burden. So it's not the fun challenge, but the darkening burden of I gotta get up by myself, and it's like this huge awful thing, right? So putting that aside, that there's like both sides of the coin in this issue, whenever there's this reconstruction of the masculine, one element that I usually see that's common is rebuilding of community, right? What else do you see, or do you want to speak a bit about this community rebuilding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one thing to maybe name as well that I've experienced, which is profound and somewhat mysterious, but I think is worthy of note, is, there's something around, well, for one, I think it might be helpful to say, at least I'm proceeding with this map or understanding that the masculine and feminine exists in all beings, right? And at the same time, there is something, called gender and has its sway depending on the cultural paradigm. And, that we could spend a lot of time unpacking that. But just to say that if we talk about masculinity and coalescing within a male-bodied person, then there's something around the inability to surrender into what we might say is more feminine qualities of, again, like the vulnerability, the softness, the allowance of emotion, in a real way. There's something that makes that difficult in the presence of women in this culture, which is, again, there's, I think, understand there's reasons for that. But I'll say the first time that I was in a men's space, an intergenerational men's space, which is in this case 2015 as well that year, I was struck by how I'd never done that before, right? I was 35 at the time, and I was like, what? This is a thing? You can actually do this? And depending on who you're speaking to, they might say, well, yeah, I've been in circles forever with women or men. But I'd been in a lot of circles, but never an intergenerational men's circle. So one, it was already somehow, some deep kind of nourishment that I hadn't felt before suddenly was there. Now, the other thing is I recognized all of the programming in me that if I'm sharing space and there's women present is like constantly jostling for, I don't know what, favor, positionality, self-consciousness or whatever it is, like all this whole programming was running. And it wasn't until I was in a men's only space that just like turned off. It just relaxed. Right. And I was like, oh, okay, that's also the benefit of having, a communal space. Now, the third thing, again, this is really interesting, is there's something about, if a man is being asked to surrender the pillar of masculinity, right? Let's say the firm solidity of, holding the container, like all these ways in which maybe kind of a neo-tantric perspective might speak about, what is the qualities of the masculine. If they're being asked to surrender it, then my sense and my understanding is that they need others to hold the masculine pillar for them to surrender into, which is why it can be so difficult, particularly if we're talking about partnerships, right, between men and women, where a woman might say like, I need you to be more tender. I want you to be more receptive. I want you to show your emotions more. And the guy's like, okay, but that means you have to hold the masculine while I surrender. And there's been my experience as well that that's not necessarily a skilled thing. Like, as in, women are kind of like, yeah, I can do that. And then, you kind of step into that space and they can't hold it, right? Maybe they get reactive, or right, that there's some kind of inability to hold that pillar. And then maybe the guy retracts and he's like, whoa, okay, this is not safe. So it asks a lot, that's what I'm trying to say, for a man who's been conditioned over and over again not to show these things, or to, be fine on your own, or to hide, or whatever it is. And that it's really vital that in this space that then others are willing to hold the masculine. And that's also why I think it's powerful that in men-only spaces where this is somewhat understood, is that men can touch levels of surrender and mutual support, which again tend to be a rare thing in mixed gender spaces. And I experienced that in a lot of men's space, Mankind Project, in my own process with that as well. Also at Sacred Sons, which again I mentioned is sort of a more of a newer organization, which does a lot of work with, I think it's more of a bioenergetics, which is a sort of, you might know more about it than me, but just a sense of tracking energy, right? And inviting the fullness of energy without much story. So it really is focusing on a kind of body-based, I won't say catharsis necessarily, but a kind of body release that requires a strong container of men to hold the level of intensity. I've been in spaces where, a fellow, bulging muscles, tattoos, I would be a little scared, if I was walking down the street and saw him coming at me. And I saw him being held by men in a space where, he would reach levels of just, rage and tears that was intense. Even in a group of men was intense, the level of intensity, and then get to a place of deep kind of humbled surrender. And it was profoundly beautiful. And I can't really see that happening again in a space where there was mixed gender, or even among women, that there was something required of a community of men to come together to hold that container for that kind of release. So last thing I'll say is, what I had this image of is almost like, in terms of the masculine wound, or maybe the trauma is so big that it requires, right, a multitude, like a larger organism, in this case of men holding a particular container for that trauma to be released in a diffused way, right? Because because it's too much for the individual to release on their own, so they actually needed to create like a buffered, container in order to find that release to hold and then come back to a kind of stasis. And I saw it again and again.
That's a beautiful way to put it, because I usually refer to the fact that trauma, even when it's lived as a personal story of isolation, as I was describing earlier, it's a byproduct of a social structure, right? And the product of that in itself, it's like things are behind that, like that create it's sort of like a domino effect in a sense, right? And I love in this picture that I see when I hear your story, how that can also be healed within a larger context, which is not like you're fucked up and it's your fault and all of this, even your fault in the sense that, I mean, lots of trauma survivors will blame themselves for a lot of the traumas that happened. And also a lot of these like more new age perspectives of you attracted it. And even when, I don't know, it might have some sort of edge around you attract this because there's a larger mission or something. But I mean, before you understand like the super transcendence of that, a lot of people go like, I attracted it, and translate it as, again, blame and guilt. And that's like not the, I mean, I've seen where it takes people after some time, and it's not a happy place. So I really like how it can be taken. Also, I mean, you can work at it with, your coach, your therapist, and work at it from an individual perspective, but also this way of healing through community. That's gorgeous. Mm-hmm. And I will pick a little bit about on this. Also, like, I mean, I know that this modernization and widespread of modern spiritualities, I know it, whenever there's like these mass tendencies or massifications of teachings, I mean, it's good because we get closer to stuff, but it also has its downsides, right? And one of the things that I have been very curious that I think I observe, and it deals with the subject that you just touched upon. Sometimes women, when there are mixed circles, as you say, I see women go into this energy where it's like, oh, men also feel, men are also tender. And then I see like a weird role that they get in, which is like sort of like a mix between maternal and condescending, and like a weird thing that I'm like, is this benefiting someone, or what's it actually benefiting, right? Because I can see from a lot of the men that I know that this creates like an allergy of like, get the fuck away. And also, but I do see some men who like to play that role and fall into that. Yes, come and, clap me because I touch into an emotion, right? Like, I'm again, this mama's boy role fulfillment. And as I'm sharing this, one of the things that comes to me is that lack of the masculine embodiment, whether that's in men or women who hold these spaces, right? And we're sort of like playing with half-cooked ability to actually hold places from a very strengthened position, we could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I can comment on the mother thing, because it's also a deep vein of inquiry. And what I've arrived at as well is, I mean, it started with Jung, I believe, but there's a sense of this idea that to mature is to differentiate, right? To reach full differentiation. And how that plays out often with the relationship to mother, at least from a sort of Western psychological understanding, is that, and this is sort of well known within men's work, mythic men's work, mythopoetic, because they borrow a lot from Jung and James Hillman and people like that. But there's a sense that the boy needs to differentiate from the psychological house of the mother, right? Because the mother in this case plays a role of the primordial source of everything, right? The goddess. I have a 3-year-old son, and it's very clear, right? Like mom's everything. And at a certain point, I think it was understood that the father's role was to, compassionately, but also firmly, guide a kind of necessary separation between that bond, right? Which is devastating to play. And I've seen it happen, in my relationship with my son as well, where, again, I become the enemy, right? Because I'm in a way, I'm needing to create boundaries because of also she's suffering if she's too available to him in sort of an entitled way. But of course, these dynamics don't automatically go away when one grows up, right? Like they carry over, of course, into adult relationships. And for men as well, of course, there's often an unconscious desire for or aversion to the mother dynamic. And that can get touched on like spaces like you just said there, where often women as well can unconsciously embody the maternal, even in a moment when that's not actually what's needed, right? There actually may be a kind of respectful distance is actually the most way of honoring. And I don't want to demonize that like outright, to say in a relationship, what I found as well, one of the biggest challenges, and again, particularly for men, is to consciously ask for maternal nurturance in the relationship, right? Because it often can go unspoken or unsaid, either desired, but not actually named, or run away from, because maybe they've internalized a sense of shame to ask for it, right? Because it feels weak, it feels vulnerable. And to consciously ask for those things in a partnership and for it to be received in that particular moment or encounter, right? But then released consciously, so then you can relate again as peers, then that's really necessary. I think that's actually part of a really mature relationship. But again, it's the unconscious nature of that, or the outright, I don't need that kind of attitude that actually, makes it more prone to distortions and stuckness.
I have recently come across this thing that you're mentioning about consciously asking for your partner to embody these roles. And I'll be honest, it didn't shock me as much as I thought it should, because in the background of the trainings that I have heard, which are, no, your partner is your partner. You cannot ask them to be your father, your mother, or your unconscious or conscious needs of other. That's not partner. And I mean, there's lots of like philosophies that are very sort of like a clear cut on these boundaries. But then I was recently introduced to this concept of another way of working around these issues, and I really trust the people behind this. So it really opened up my mind to, sometimes we can play that. And it also, I'm hearing this, of course, from the female perspective that I identify with. And I'm asking, what would it take in me to hold that space for my partner? And as you said earlier, you really need to have, your masculine embodied, like really integrated in order to play that role, but no, you're not that role, and being aware enough to not continue the dynamic outside of that, fulfilling that immediate need. And I know that maybe for some people who are listening, it will come as a shock if you're very used to, as I just mentioned, this idea of no, your partner is your partner, and this role needs to be respected to maintain the dynamic or whatever. And while there might be some wisdom in that, in a sense that we cannot do it unconsciously, right? Unconsciously, it's going to make a mess. But from a very mature unconscious perspective, it really offers a solution to one thing. In lots of therapies, I hear, what you didn't get from your mother, what you didn't get from your father or elsewhere, you shouldn't ask your partner because that's too much, but you should get it elsewhere. And while that sounds okay, and that sounds like a good idea, where the hell do you find these resources? Because we are not used to having strengthened communities where you can, for one, openly really vulnerable subjects, open emotionally as much as these kinds of things actually require, and having just like, you know, the emotional maturity to be able to do this role playing or assume these roles, or even, you know, I'm sure you touch upon this with archetypes, the role of the leader, the elder, the wise person. These are all cut off from our lives. So then where are we actually going to resource this thing that we're supposed to resource outside, right?
Yeah, I'd be happy to offer some perspective on that. I mean, this is also why in the course of my work as well, I was drawn to a community in Portugal called Tamera, right, which you might have heard of. And that was really my, you know, one, they invited me based on a film I had made called Sacred Economics, which really looked at a different kind of economic system, right? What would it embody that would, you know, be in a story of interdependence, right, instead of domination, which is really the current model. But Tamera, they were like, hey, you know, we're doing really interesting things over here. You might be interested. And so I ended up going there with a fellow filmmaker in 2015 as well. It was a big year. And what I found there was, again, much of what you're talking about. It was a profound immersion into what I would call a sort of, you know, experiment at re-villaging, in this case from a European lineages. They're primarily German, and they started there, and then they moved to Portugal in I believe 2005, and have been there ever since. Now they really have been really, I guess, researching what are the processes, right? What are the ways in which we need to build group dynamics that can provide these kinds of support? Because so much of the absence of that, the consequence of the absence, right, of these kind of wider social supports, is everything falls on the partnership, you know, the nuclear partnership. And it's just really obvious, right? That's just not, or that's way too much to ask another person to be all of those things and to support in all of those ways. And yet most people, that's all they know, right? That's all they know. And so of course they would look there, and then maybe the relationship is strained or it fails, and they're like, what happened? And I mean, it never was meant to be those things. But I would say that largely as a consequence of industrial civilization, that this is one of the main consequences. So Tamara has really sort of recultured their way towards a much more diverse and mutually supportive cultural environment. And one particular practice that they do use is called the forum, which is not anything to do with landmark forum. Sometimes people will say, oh, like landmark. And it's a very different process. It's very much like a kind of Gestalt-based psychodrama sort of practice, where there's two facilitators. There's a circle created, and then people are allowed to go in and basically bring whatever, right? Bring whatever drama that is going on in their lives. And there's another practitioner called Clinton Callahan, who he wrote in his book, I think it's called The Power of Conscious Feelings. But there's an aspect of there he calls low drama and high drama. And I really like the difference, actually, the distinction he makes. He's not talking about forum, although he is familiar with Tamara. But he uses other modalities. But he says low drama is that sort of, he calls it like gremlin food. You know, it's all the kind of passive aggressiveness or just like, you know, conflict, or, you know, just stickiness. Like when people are unconsciously creating drama because they're, you know, they don't know how to know better, or they don't want to know better. Right? Whereas sometimes spiritual circles, spiritual practitioners, right, will sort of distance themselves from low drama and say, you know, I'm above this, and, you know, it doesn't touch me, and I've transcended, you know, all this. But that if they don't understand the importance of high drama, which is the other aspect, then they bypass, right, all of those things that are actually going on for them, and they give no space for it, which is why I think we see a lot of dysfunction in spiritual communities as well. So Tamara creates space. I don't know if they would use this language, but I see it as they create space for high drama, which is where you can consciously bring, you know, big things that are also experienced as personal to the circle, like whether it is, you know, maybe some big dynamic that's going on with someone's, you know, mother story, or archetypal mother, or, you know, erotic fantasy, or anger around a situation that happened in the community, or, you know, anything that can be brought, and they perform it, you know, in a way that is meant to be embodied and expressive and really in many ways playful, even though they can really touch on, you know, pretty intense things. And from that experience, the facilitator also guides them right into kind of like looking at it differently, embodying it differently, into some kind of moment of revelation, I won't say catharsis either, because sometimes that is just, it's not about just yelling at a pillow or something. It's like that there's insight actually that can come from this process. And often that is what happens. And then once that performance is over, as they call it, the community is invited to come in and mirror the person actually of what they saw, not advice, but actually just, oh, I saw, this dynamic, or I saw that. And it's a profound kind of meta organism perspective of being able to like reflect on your own experience, but through all of these people who care and love you, as well as it builds trust in the community, because now you can see like, oh, I thought that guy was just an asshole, but it actually turns out he's working on this issue, and like that's what's going on for him. And if we don't create these spaces, right, where this high drama can be played out, it's going to come out somewhere. And again, and particularly for men as well, right? Lots going on that without the right spaces, it'll just come out sideways, or it'll be numb. It'll be turned internal. And we see that, we see what that leads to. At the worst, it's a shootout, or a shoot up in a shopping mall or a school, right? Particularly for men. But if they were given a place to feel of consequence and that their experiences matter, right? They won't take up the whole room. It'll just be, rightfully put in their place.
And if I may get a little personal here, after you've witnessed this type of experiences, could I say that? When you've submerged yourself in this type of experience, because I know that this can be like super deep, it goes deep in your tissues, and to be able to be in a place where, I know that they go by trust, transparency, and these things that we don't usually operate by, right? My perspective is that you cannot unsee what you just saw and not live what you lived. How do you, or what do you bring back after you've been in this type of environment into your life outside community and outside these places that can create a very mature holding?
You mean, for example, like coming back from Tamara into how I live now? Yeah. I'd say it's, in one way, it's deeply painful, right? Because having seen what's possible, and I'm not saying they're the way, but there's certainly a way of regenerating a more, culture that really is attuned both to, each other and to life. It's devastating to then not have that, and to just sort of see, all of the absences, right? Which is so much of what I see now. I really feel like I've sort of come from another planet now. And, when I talk to people as well, and I'm trying to explain things, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, as in, I've gotten better at it. And over the years, I've been also working on a film about this community, which is, to be released finally this year. And hopefully, again, that'll be a good step to be like, no, look, we really saw something. It's like going to Oz, right? And coming back and saying, no, but you were there. And but I'll just say that it also has lit a fire in me to try to create as much as possible these structures of support. And I'll just say, for example, the forum practice, I did bring it back to my community after my first visit, after I experienced it, and tried to plant it there, and in varying, expressions of attempts. And I'll say that it did have a pretty profound effect on the community, and also learned a lot actually about when not to do it, which is also any sort of cautionary tale for people who want to open these spaces. I'll just say, be prepared, because talking about trauma again, there's such an undercurrent of unprocessed trauma in the field, basically, that anytime you open this kind of space, if you don't do it well, you tap this like vein of, all this stuff that's just waiting to have the right moment, and can really be disruptive and can be too much energy to hold in a space. So you really have to be pretty, clear on your intention and the commitment of the people that are there. Like, you don't just open this on a, Tuesday afternoon because you feel like it. Like, you really want a committed group of people that are like, okay, we're in for a period to see where this goes. Not a too permeable boundary can be really, difficult, because then people don't know who's coming next week, or that, the trust, it has to be there to be able to go. But, that aside, you can reach actually some profound places. And then, of course, the challenge becomes, so how do we live this then? And, you butt up against the culture as it is, which is primarily based on disassociation and commodification. And it's, it's a real troubled abyss between there and here, in my experience.
Yeah. Well, that's so many things about what you just said, right? And I do remember that they say do not do this type of work, the forum work outside of a community.
Yeah.
Because I mean, as you were saying, it's deep work, right? And it's not just, I see a lot of people who come into like this, oh, this is alternative, this is new, this is spiritual. And there's like a high, right, at the beginning of when you come in contact with this type of practices, even yoga or whatever. And that's the stage where you want everybody to come in, and you want, this, you should have a session with this person, or you should do the ayahuasca or whatever, it's like this enthusiasm phase that's like cool, but like be wary that there's so many more elements around that. And it does need us to be a little bit more centered if we want to actually go into this stuff like hardcore, right?
Yeah, I mean, that I might have been Jamie Wheel, I think, on some podcast I heard recently, but he was saying how, if anybody goes and experiences some kind of new modality, and they're basically, they're it's like new relationship energy, right? This like, oh my God, how did I not know about this? Everybody needs to know. And then they try to turn it into a career like much too quickly, rather than saying, oh wait, this is just part of a healing experience that I've had, and maybe my path is just to incorporate it into my life, not change my life and become the shaman tomorrow, which is so much of that sort of leaping too quickly impulse, right, the quick fix. And there's a lot of understanding or wisdom around, again, like needing to be cooked for some time in these kinds of things before you can really lead appropriately. And I'm saying I was in some ways also naive to say, hey, let's try this here in the community. Which in some ways, yeah, we have to be willing to experiment, but also, I was willing to be sort of ongoingly reflected as well, and sort of take ongoing and often sometimes critical feedback, right, to be in that kind of position. And it can be bracing, to be there.
You were also mentioning that when you come back, you see the missing pieces, right? That you didn't even know that there were. Like, they, in marketing, they usually talk about, that the iPhone was such a big hit because they created a need. They usually have this like marketing line, right? And it's a need that you didn't have. You didn't need an iPhone several years ago. I don't know how many, but you didn't need one. And now if you don't have one, it's like, where do I find my maps? Where do I take pictures with? Like, it's already part of your idea of what life should have, right? And this sort of like opens a very wide question for me. On one side, of course, the effect of having been in this very nurturing and very enriching experience of community, but also in a sense, even when we don't have, let me try to word this easily, even when we haven't had that experience, like in this body, right? We haven't experienced being there. I think we all have sort of like a remembrance or like a deep memory of what it feels to feel sort of like complete. And I'm quoting this, right? And I think trauma, in a sense, is the yearning for that completeness, right? Talking in more poetic language, right? Because Ian and I were talking before we came into the recording about, well, there's lots of ways to talk about trauma. And that's sort of like one of my intentions around the podcast, to address all of the different perspectives. And, you have the shaman's way of talking about trauma, which is beautiful. And also from the neuroscience, which is also very enriching. And from this, as I say, like this yearning for something, I kept remembering one of Bert Hellinger, the creator of family constellations. He said, whenever I come in contact with a constellation, every time I come into contact with a constellation, he says, my question is, what is missing here? What's the element that's missing? And of course, he's referring to the precise tool of family constellations, where it's about integrating, and integration is gonna take you into that next step of healing. But also in this context that you deal with around men, one of the things that I see from the outside, because I'm not in men's work, I love to have my space from that. But of course, I encourage it a lot, and I am super happy that it's getting a little bit more popular, I would say. Or actually, what I want to say is that people, and men particularly, are less afraid to step into these places, right? And I wanted to ask you, what's that missing piece that you see for men specifically? So I approach it like from a systemic perspective, family, culture, and also, as we spoke in Tamara's vision, like these missing elements that they want to rebuild around community. But in the work that you have seen close to men, what are those missing pieces? I know there's lots, but what would be key pieces?
Mm-hmm. I'd say the major missing piece is a cultural context that is actually bound to the land. And in this sense, right, it's not just men's work, but it's all anything conducted in the wake of industrial civilization. And that, again, it'd just be helpful to talk about what is culture then, right? Because, if somebody doesn't really differentiate between kinds of culture, they'll be like, oh, no, that's the same as that one, just a bit different. And I would make the case, as some of my teachers have done, that culture is an achievement. Like real culture is an achievement. And, there's a reason why the more modernity in modern civilization, the more places it touches, everywhere starts to look the same, right? And therefore, it's probably more helpful to think of modern culture as not a real culture. It's the absence of culture. Because like a living organism, right? We even use the same thing. Like when you say you culture, or ferment, like there's a sort of sense of that it's a living thing, that the dominant culture survives by eating other cultures, right? So that's a sort of deeply troubling understanding, but it makes sense when you think about it, because again, it turns to the same everything it touches, and those places start to lose the specificity. They start to lose the rituals. They start to lose the things that actually make them bound to their place, right? Which is what it means to be indigenous. And so I think modern culture is striving to react to that kind of spiritual whole, right, at the core of the anti-culture, and masculinity as well is trying to find like what can I give myself to really. Whereas there's a certain paradox, right? When you participate in the dominant culture, you're participating in the destruction of life, because the culture itself is constantly eating away, right, at life's ecosystems. And so when one tries to like step outside of that and say, no, I'm going to heal, I'm not going to be that, then you sort of innately confront, right, that, oh, wait a second, there's no universalist response to a universalist problem, right? This idea that all men are, toxic masculinity is a sort of universalist frame of like, these are bad behaviors, right? And these are good behaviors for men. And that question itself, though, comes from essentially from nowhere, like from no culture, no specific culture. So in my journey with the podcast, I stopped really asking, what does it mean to be a good man? But I'd say, what does it mean to be a good man now, and in which context? Like now and where, right? Because that's the beginnings of a kind of place-based, time-based understanding of what does it mean, and starting to make that more, articulated, because that has the possibility of actually being, useful, I think, to the time, as opposed to, because anytime you're trying to have a universal response, it's too big to fit the specifics, right? Like it's just too broad. It's the McDonald's of, everywhere. And yet we need specificity, actually, more than more. We need people being willing to reclaim their own ancestral lineages, right? Because we all have that. And you talked about this idea, right, of, this longing to be whole, right? And I also think a longing to belong somewhere again, in a meaningful way. I think that's actually the heart. So men's work as it is practiced now, so much of it is sort of in the absence of culture, or a culture understanding. And so that, until that's really understood deeply, I think it'll always feel pretty good. Like, as in, you can get your personal growth kind of, momentum going, and you can learn things and you can heal things, sure, right? But it won't ever transcend and to become a real cultural possibility until this is really, I think, at the heart of it.
I absolutely love that, Ian. And I think I will quote you in the future when I speak about this topic, the importance of contextualizing what we mean by the healthy masculine, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think lots of men feel the constraint of this idea of this is toxic masculinity and this is the way that it should be, even when we haven't really deciphered what that is, right? And I know some women, and I know this is not very popular, but we say like, actually, I do like these things. I do like these traits. Like, please don't take that away from me. I like it. I enjoy it. And I know this is very cultural because I see this happening very differently in different countries and different. So I love the idea of contextualizing that and understanding how, whether it's an evolution process, a developmental cultural process, or just like a fucking preference, you know, which is as valid as anything that's evolutionary, right? But respecting the need for a context of what's real and possible for a culture. That's, I like that very much. Thank you.
Glad to offer.
So as we come to a close, I don't know if there's something else that you would love to talk about from all of the topics that we've opened today.
Yeah, I think I'd just love to offer to what I understand as a picture of the possible, which is, you know, usually where I like to head is, you know, when we talk about trauma, when we talk about, you know, coming back to a certain authenticity, like why would we do that, right? Other than to just feel better about ourselves. And my understanding is, you know, I've looked to the models of what I understand and how the phenomenon of emergence works and why actually this is so helpful, I think, at this moment. So those of you as, you know, listeners who might study emergence, or maybe you have, I mean, a simple version of it is just to say it's how complexity arises out of simplicity. It's just a very basic thing, right? And oftentimes people will look to a flock of birds, such as the starlings, you know, moving over a sky, and they sort of move together as this meta-organism, right? They seem to be all part of the same being, even though of course they're not. They're separate beings, but something emerges from them all moving together in a certain way, and that happens too with schools of fish and ants, and you can see it in a lot of places. And so for me, why this is important is because if one could look at what is happening there, you know, I like this lens of, it is the movement of eros, right? E-R-O-S. If we just understand it to mean life energy, right? And oftentimes we sort of apply it, or it's applied to this idea of the erotic, right? Sort of sexual love. But I think it's helpful, as Tamara does, they expand on it a little more and just say, well, it's the movement of life's energy. It's how life wants to move, right? Ever more, you know, diverse and beautiful and generative ways. And so why, you know, for me, well, the relationship between trauma and emergence is that if we are traumatized and we have patterns of dysfunction and distortion within us, then it becomes difficult for life to move through us in an intelligent way, right? That's how I would put those two together. Because I do think life is trying to move through us. Like when we are tuned to the movements of life, to the land, to the rhythms, right, of the place we are, to our own body's energies as life and how it wants to move, right? Like imagine magical things happen, right? Magical things can come forth. And I think we're so used to living in, at least in, again, like a modern Western, not just Western, but a sort of modern context, is to proceed through domination, right? The book, The Chalice and the Blade by Riane Eisler is a fantastic look at essentially a cultural distinction between domination cultures and partnership cultures. And how she talks about domination is basically, you know, it's basically the application of force. And I think so much of the way that we conduct ourselves and our cities and our working lives is basically a kind of either overt or covert domination, right? You know, we dominate ourselves with caffeine to like wake up more and like head to work, or we dominate ourselves out of the sleeping patterns that actually, you know what, afternoon, I want to take a nap. I mean, my body does, but you know, no, I got to do the thing. I got to be productive. You know, particularly men can fall into this. But if we actually surrender to these rhythms and come into partnership, both with the body and of life, and I think partnership is difficult when we're traumatized, right? Because there's distortions, there's fundamental distortions of feeling unsafe, of replaying old stories or old scripts. And that is why it's necessary to come to a place of integration and healing. But again, why is because then life can move through us in a more natural way, and we become agents in partnership with life itself. So that to me is how they relate to each other, and why it's helpful to have that understanding that it actually, you know, healing oneself is great, but it's actually how we become able to be orchestrated by life itself, which possibly, and I've seen this, can lead to, again, ever more beautiful expressions of of a kind of partnership that I don't think we've ever seen actually, but is the promise of the age.
That's definitely a challenge, or it sounds like a challenge, but it sounds like it has a very nice price at the end of the road.
Yeah.
Yeah. One last question from me, and it sort of like wraps up lots of things that we have discussed in a very concrete thing for our listeners today. What have you seen is useful for the role of fathers in the future, in this new culture that you refer to as an emergence that's needed?
What is helpful from the role of fathers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, like I said, I have a 3-year-old son, and so I'm discovering really what that is, right? And I think certainly for men in this culture that we are models of masculinity certainly for our sons and daughters. And I do think there's some, fathering has gotten a bad rap. Patriarchy and its sort of mythic understanding isn't the rule of men, it's the rule of the father, right? That's like the old understanding of it. And of course, so patriarchy, of course, gets a really bad rap these days as sort of the root of everything ill. And I would just make the distinction, as Rian Eisler does, that it's actually domination culture, not patriarchy. If we try to actually separate those two things. But I think one of the consequences of demonizing patriarchy is, again, we demonize fathering, which is, again, people like Jordan Peterson also, can get a bad rap depending on who you're talking to. But one of the things he did sort of make a case for is that young men in particular are going to be much more likely to be delinquents when their father is absent, right? When they don't have actually strong male role models in their lives. And that's not blaming the mother, but it's like saying that there's something that the father provides, which is really necessary and vital. And so, for me, I do think there is some necessary reclamation of the inherent nobility of fathering, and also not to try to play into ideas of, perfection and, having to be, everything. And that the more that I can also as a father come into relationship to other men, including other fathers. For example, I help steward a father group, actually, in my community here as well, where fathers get together and, talk and work. So it's men's work and fathering, which is really vital because, like Bayo Akomolafe says in one of my other conversations, that fathering is a community endeavor. It's not necessarily just individual endeavor. So for me, opening up that understanding, again, not from the sole hero father needing to be everything, but recognizing that we are stronger fathers together, coming back into that reclamation, I think is really necessary for this time.
That's great, Ian. Thank you so much. So before we consider this session closed, where would you like people to follow you or follow your work or contact you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they're welcome to check out the Mythic Masculine podcast, which, any platform you look, Apple, Spotify, as well as most of my films over the last 15 years and writings are available on my website. It's ianmac.com, IANMACK.com. And the film that we mentioned that I was doing about this community in Portugal called Tamara, the film is available at thesacredmatrix.com, or at least, information about the film, and it'll be released in the months to come. But yeah, if they want to connect there, there's lots available.
Wonderful. Do you have an estimate for when it's going to be out?
Well, we're hoping Beltane, which is the time of year when, the real Eros of the earth is illumined and charged once again. Feels like the right moment to bring something like this to the world.
Wonderful. I would definitely recommend that for anyone who has resonated with some of the things that we shared today. Thank you so much, Ian, for having accepted our invitation to the Embodiment Podcast. I'm very happy to have had you here in the interview. And bye, everyone. See you soon.